Welcome back to another edition of Talking Ball. It's Jack with JD, and today we have a great game to preview here. Duke versus Auburn. It's going to be a lot of fun. Before we get into Auburn, keys to the game from the Duke side of things, the AP poll came out earlier today. What were your takeaways, JD?
Well, I think, first of all, being Duke fans, that we had a loss to Kansas, although they were the number one team. And then we came back and we beat Seattle without much problem. And we wind up going from number 11 to number 9. We go up 2 spots and we're 5-2. And so the biggest thing that usually I don't really, I mean, maybe Duke deserves it. It's hard to say. It's so early in the season, but they're 5-2 and they're number 9. Wisconsin, number 11, undefeated. Oregon, number 12, undefeated. Florida, SEC, tough competition, 13, undefeated. Cincinnati, undefeated, number 14. So, I don't know. I think if we lose to Auburn, we're going to drop. But John Shire, when he had this plan of, I think I'm going to pick a couple of teams, and not, the Champions Classic, it turned out it was Kansas. They were number 1. Auburn initially was.
Wait. Before we get some comments here, Champions Classic was Kentucky. And when we played them, they'd moved up to 19th. Kansas was a neutral site game that we just played in Las Vegas, and Auburn is part of the SEC ACC challenge. So I don't know how much. I just don't know how much inner workings, are the coaches included in that scheduling? I'm not sure how that works, in fairness. I get where you're going with the point of Shire, but at the same time, how much credit should we really give him? Champions Classic started by Coach K. He's kind of continued it. Give him credit for scheduling Kansas, for sure, and Arizona. That was a home-and-home scheduled under Shire. But the other 2 games are kind of just part of the natural flow of things, if you will.
Well, good correction. We definitely would have been all over us. There are only 4 teams, and I didn't get it quite right there. But we could have drawn Michigan State, who is not a ranked team, but instead it was Kentucky.
Yep.
Look, Arizona at the time we played them was a ranked team. They have fallen out of the top 25. You had called that earlier in the week, that they were not going to make it into the top 25. But as it turns out, he's playing 1, 2, and 4. Now, I get that these are tune-up games, but he has his hands full, so it's hard to know. If you wanted to know how they stack up against the best teams in the country, you drew 1, 2, and 4, and we're certainly going to have our hands full. But we'll get to that. There's a couple. I mean, UConn, another one. Yeah, almost were right when you told me that they were going to fall out of the top 25. They're hanging on by their fingertips at number 25. And the only other observation that I have is that, so after this, when we go to ACC play, Pitt is now 18 and UNC is now 20. So, yes, they're 2 ranked teams, and I know you're very high on Louisville and that game, so you're, expecting them to wind up there. But it's not like the competition that Auburn, Kentucky are going to face in their league play. I mean, they're going to just be going up against each other. I think Florida, number 13, is also in that.
Correct.
Right? So they're also in the SEC. I mean, there's just going to be some every night. It's going to be really. That may be at the moment the best conference last year? It was the Big 12 or where Houston.
It's one or the other. It's the Big 12 or it's the SEC. As of right now, because I think, and I think you agree, Auburn is number one team in the country ahead of Kansas, opposed to what the AP poll says. I would give the slight edge to the SEC. Also, Alabama, another top, I think top 10, top 15 ranked team. But the Big 12 number one team as of right now, Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, Oklahoma, I believe, is up now in the top 25 after they beat Arizona. So there's a number of good programs also in the Big 12 as well. So I think it's one or the other. But I think this would be a good time to start looking ahead to the Auburn matchup. And the only other thing I would say about the rankings as a Duke fan, a Duke supporter, is that, the two teams, I know you rattled off a bunch of teams that are undefeated, that are lower ranked than Duke. But Duke has lost to 1 and 4 by a combined 8 points. And so if one of those games goes another way, we kind of look at Duke a little bit differently. But with that being said, they didn't. And Duke is 1 and 2 in their early Big Four games. I thought coming into the season, my prediction was they would go 3 and 1. So I obviously had that one wrong. And I'm hoping that they can at least split it and go 2 and 2 with a big home win over Auburn. But let's talk about Auburn, who, as we've talked about, we think they've been the best team in the country. They have been outstanding early on this season. They've been led by Johni Broome, who came back after a National Player of the Year candidate type season. It went to Zach Edey, but Johni Broome was on that short list after him. He's currently leading Auburn in points, rebounds. He's tied for the lead in assists, and he also leads them in blocks, and he's just 0.1 off from being tied for the lead in steals. So he almost leads them in all 5 significant categories. He has added a 3-point shot to his game. He's 6'10", 240. They've played him as a power forward this year. They've moved Dylan Cardwell into the starting lineup, who's 6'11", 255. And Chad Baker-Mazara, who's 6'7", 180. Denver Jones, who's 6'4", 205. And Miles Kelly, 6'6", 190, have rounded out the starting lineup in the past handful of games for Auburn. And the quick thing I want to say before we get more into this Auburn team, JD, is this going to be one of the first times, probably maybe the only time this season, that Duke is going to be up against a starting 5 that is bigger than they are. Because with Cardwell and Johni Broome as your starting 4-5, you go 6'10", 6'11", 240, 255. And so that is going to be something that Duke is going to have to contend with. And their guards, their smallest guard, 6'4". So it's not like Duke will have an edge in the size in that area as well.
I never really bought the idea that the Duke is the tallest team in the country. Therefore, what? They're tall. Okay, I get it. I never understood that. What I'm going to be watching here is, and boy, to those that have been following us and listening to our broadcast, our guard play, our point guard play is really going to be put to the test against Auburn's full court press. If they throw that on early, and there's no way that Foster can handle this. And I hope that Coach Shire has a trick or two up his sleeves for how to break this press, because it is awesome. We talked about it when Auburn played Iowa State, a game that I did watch. It's insane. It is just, okay. For our fans, I'm going to go all the way back to the Arkansas Razorbacks when Coach Nolan Richardson, 40 minutes of hell. They're capable of doing it because they play 9 players, and they can press as much as they want. I don't know why they wouldn't keep up that kind of defensive intensity against a Duke team that struggles at the point guard position.
Well, going back to that Iowa State game, because I think you made a point, I think, after the Seattle game, which was, is Duke kind of like a Houston or an Iowa State? Like the defense is really good, but offensively, you've got questions. And so for me, the fact that Auburn has played both of those teams, I think, is noteworthy because those are, can be similar to what Duke is going to present to Auburn in some ways. And in both of those games, especially the Iowa State game, Auburn had to come back from a deficit. The Iowa State game that you mentioned, they were down 16 points at halftime. As a Iowa State supporter and also somebody who had money on Iowa State in that game, I was feeling pretty good. But I also felt like Auburn was going to make a run at some point. Did I think they would make the run that they did at the start of the second half? No, that was kind of insane. Auburn really took over very quickly at the start of that second half of that game because their defensive intensity was at a different level than it was in the first half. I don't know what they did at halftime, what Bruce Pearl said, or maybe if it was his son, who's an associate head coach, Stephen Pearl, who they, Coach Pearl, Bruce Pearl, I should say to be specific, gave a lot of credit to for that comeback win. But they were like a different team in the second half. As you said, the defensive intensity for Auburn was ratcheted up to a level that Iowa State could not deal with, and they have a good point guard in Timmy Lipsey. And to your point, there's certainly questions about Duke's point guard. But the player I would highlight in that game, and he's a really key player for Auburn, is Chad Baker-Mazara, who is one of, you mentioned they've got 9 rotation players. He's one of 6 of these 9 rotation players who didn't start their career at Auburn. And he's on his 4th school. He started at Duquesne, then he went to San Diego State. He played a year at a junior college let me get this right, at Northwest Florida State is the name of the school. I finally got that one out. And now he's at his 2nd year in Auburn. So this is an old, experienced team. Baker-Mazara, unfortunately, it's kind of a little bit of a theme. In the Yale game, he got ejected. Didn't think he should have been ejected, in fairness. And that's kind of what changed the tide of that game. Iowa State game, he goes out with about 10 minutes left in the first half. Iowa State was winning at this point, but he goes out with an injury. Comes back at the start of the second half. The defensive intensity is at a different level. And more importantly, he was hitting his shots. He hit several three-pointers all in the second half. He's a big key because this is a team that does shoot the ball well, but doesn't have a ton of guys outside of him. And a guy we'll get to in a minute, Tahad Pettiford, that I think are clear, like out and out. You've got to be careful with those guys in terms of their shooting ability consistently. They have other guys who can do it, but maybe not as consistently as those two, in my opinion.
Make your point on Pettiford, because then I want to do a little John A. Broome versus Cooper Flag. I have some interesting stats on that one. So finish up on Pettiford.
So Pettiford is one of the 4 players who comes off the bench for Auburn. We'll touch on everybody here, but he's somebody I wanted to highlight because he was a freshman who didn't get a ton of buzz coming into this season. And what he did, especially in the Houston game, really raised my eyebrows in terms of how good Tahad Pettiford is. Not only as a point guard can he make plays for his teammates, but his ability to create space offensively and especially get to his step back 3 is really good and really important for an Auburn team that at times when Johni Broome is not on the court can struggle to create offense. And Pettiford, again, especially in the Houston game, was that 1-2 punch with Johni Broome for Auburn that provided the offense to go along with their great defense.
So I was watching a lot of the highlights of Johni Broome. This is one talented, smooth, smart, offensive player, causes a lot of disruption, can rebound. At 6'10", I was watching him bring the ball up. It was pretty remarkable. So just a couple of quick stats between our guy Coop and Janai Brown. So points, as you point, 20.7 points versus Coop, who's at 15.9. And we've always said it's okay. But then you go to rebounds, and Jonai is just shy of 13 rebounds compared to 8.3 for Coop. Assists, I'll give it to Coop. He's definitely a better passer and just really needs his court awareness to improve slightly. But on blocks, where we know that Cooper Flagg can get to the ball, it's Jonai Broom who has been doing it. Now, what's interesting about those stats is that we've been always saying how, but Coop plays 38 minutes, 37 minutes. Those stats for both players are based on an average of 7 games where Jonai has played 30 minutes per game and Coop 31. Hard to imagine. He seems to be always on the court, but 31 has been his average. So we're going to need Cooper Flagg to step it up in this game, and it's almost like we need him to step it up, and I wouldn't be – I've been saying that it might have been K2 that was the guard to bring it up because he could see over everyone, but Coop may even have to bring the ball up, but he gets rattled, when the pressure gets on him, and there will be 2-1 on him right away. So
let's revisit more the Duke side in just a couple minutes here, as we're almost done. We're almost done with Auburn, and then I think it's a good point in terms of, listen, I think as a quick aside, I think this is the first game this year, as much as credit you want to give to Hunter Dickinson for being a good college player, I think this is the first game this year where...
Boo! The new villain! The new villain! Hunter Dickinson! Tripper! My man Grayson's no longer number 1.
It was more of a kick than a trip. But with that being said, this is the first game this year where I think Cooper Flagg won't be the best player on the court. I think it will technically be Janai Broom. And to your point, can Cooper raise his level like he did in the first 2 big games with Kentucky and Arizona to match Auburn? But I think it's going to be difficult because my guess is Dylan Cardwell will be the guy who matches up with Cooper. It'll change throughout the game. Cardwell is a great defender, but he is traditionally a guy who defends centers. So that is something I'm going to be curious about in terms of the matchup. He is pretty athletic. He can guard. He's like a bigger version of KJ Adams, so Cooper will certainly have the quickness advantage, but I think they're going to try to force him to shoot jumpers. And from what we've seen early on this year, that's not Cooper's strength. So I'm curious how he will kind of manage that. Going through the rest of Auburn's roster really quickly here, JD, we've got Denver Jones, he's a guy who will guard the perimeter, guard the guy bringing up the ball, can also shoot the 3. Pretty good. Not quite as good as Baker Mazara or Pettiford. Miles Kelly is a guy Duke fans should be a little bit familiar with. He did play at Georgia Tech, comes into this Auburn program. He's a streaky shooter for sure, so hopefully it's not his night on Wednesday night at 9, a little after 9 o'clock Eastern time. Chaney Johnson comes off the bench. He is their leading scorer off the bench, over 10 points a game, 6'7", 225. He'll play the power forward position next to either Janai Broom or Cardwell. And the last 2 guys from Auburn's rotation, JP Pegues, thought he was going to play a big role on this Auburn team after averaging nearly 18 points per game for Furman last year. Not been the case. He struggled early for Auburn, really like 3 points per game in a limited role off the bench. And lastly, Chris Moore, 6'6", energy guy off the bench. So their size off the bench isn't the same as their starters. Moore does provide good energy. When Mazzara wasn't in the game, it seemed like Coach Pearl made a point to have Chris Moore in there to keep the energy levels up. He's not an offensive threat, but he gives good defensive effort and rebounding. So this is a really good Auburn team. Great Auburn team, I should say. And they're well balanced. They play 9 guys. They've got different guys who can beat you depending on the night, but they are certainly led by Janai Broome. And so, as you said, can Cooper Flagg kind of match the level of a Janai Broome? And that's something we're going to have to see. I think the one thing certainly that is in Duke's advantage in this game is that it's a home game. And so hopefully they'll get a little bit of a, friendly Cameron indoor whistle. The crowd should be up for this game. If they're not up for this game, or are we just waiting for North Carolina? Like, this is almost as big as you'll get for a Duke game at Cameron Indoor. So there's a couple of things working for Duke's benefit. Maybe this is a stretch. This is a stretch. Maybe the fact that it's been a little bit of time in between the Maui trip for Auburn, they may have rested a little bit. Maybe they're not quite as sharp. Just trying to be maybe a little bit hopeful for the Dukies here. But what do you want to see from Duke in this game against Auburn? What are the couple of things that you're looking for?
So the first thing is the first 4 minutes, the first segment. This has all the makings of a 16-4. We are down in the first segment. If and we know we have a good defensive team, but if we go deep in the hole here, I'm afraid that hole may be too big to climb out of. And I know against Seattle, it was good to see that Coach Scheyer did give minutes to other players. The offensive weapon, seldom used, but you and I look at Isaiah Evans and go, I don't understand. This guy is instant offense, but, I hope he gets minutes in this game. So that's another thing. I do not believe, and I was starting to say it earlier, that the backcourt is. I just don't see how they are the ones to break the pick, and I am sure Scheyer has been working on that all week to break the press, to try to figure out how the first pass goes in. I mean, maybe the first pass from Foster goes into Flagg. And then Flagg's job is but he's going to draw that immediate trap. And it's going to be 2-on-1. And so far, when we've seen him 2-on-1 in the corner on offense, he tries to dribble through it. And so someone has to tell him, or the spin move, someone has to tell him, ball goes to you, pass immediately. There is going to be somebody open. You're tall enough, and that's how we break the press.
Yeah, and I've tried to be at least a Caleb Foster optimist. And you mentioned at the start of the season, before we even, we were in exhibition games, you said, how is this team going to deal with the press? Can we deal with the press? And you were maybe a little pessimistic about our chances. And we saw against Arizona, who I don't think has the defense nearly as good as Auburn, that Foster struggled against the press. And Coach Scheyer took him out of the game late in the second half of that one. So I agree. I'm cautiously optimistic about how we will deal with the Auburn press. To your point, can we avoid a bad first segment like we had against Kansas? And that lingered past the first segment. And that can't happen against Auburn.
We kept having to come back, get close, come back, get close, come back. Even I think twice we took a 1 point lead, or
Oh, I
once
wasn't
even.
even getting that far ahead. I was just saying we had 16 points through 12 minutes of that game versus Kansas. It's going to be a real mountain to climb against Auburn if we have a similar type performance. But speaking of that, the one thing I wanted to highlight before this game is that I think these two teams, well, the results may not be quite so similar. When you kind of like drill down a little bit deeper, the two Duke losses to Kentucky and Kansas have been by a combined 8 points. And as you highlighted at the start of our show here today, those are teams 1 and 4 in the country. The two, granted, Auburn has more than 2 big wins. They beat North Carolina. They beat a good Memphis team. But those are the 3 ranked teams that they've played. Iowa State, Houston, North Carolina. The Iowa State and Houston games were decided by a total of 7 points. So one game goes one way, the other game goes another way. You're looking at 2 6-1 teams right now. So I do think, while there are certainly things that you could be concerned about in this particular matchup for Duke, especially for Duke offensively, I think defensively Duke has all of the tools to make this a tough game for Auburn. And speaking of that, I think Kaman Malawach is going to be a really important player for Duke in this game because, as we've highlighted, Johni Broome he's the key, whatever term you want to use, he is the most important player for Auburn. And as we've watched Duke throughout this year, I think in some ways, and I could really regret saying this in about 48 hours or a little over 48 hours, but in some ways, I think it may be a good thing that the best player for Auburn is a de facto center, because although he starts off at the power forward spot, because Malawach and Malik Brown, in very different ways, have been Duke's best defenders. Cooper's certainly up there. Proctor certainly has a case, but I think the Duke's center defense is a strength of this team. And so having those two guys, and you can even maybe, if we get into foul trouble, we've got 15 fouls. Gangba is certainly a big body who can go out there. And so that is one area where I do feel like going into this game, Duke may have an answer for a guy like Johni Broome. But on the other side of the ball, just staying on Malawach for a second, I feel like that as a team have not done a good job of finding him around the basket. And this might be a tough game for Malawach with the size of Auburn, but when they don't have both Cardwell and Broome out there, I think we've got to do a better job of finding Malawach around the rim or finding him for an open 3, because he's shown a lot of evidence of having good touch around the basket from the free throw line, and he can hit a 3. So I think he's got to be more involved in the offense for Duke, and that comes down to not only the guards, but also K2, who actually does a pretty good job of finding Mal, and Cooper Flag.
So the notion of here's the starting 5, I think we've got to do away with this. The notion of these are the 5 guys. I think it really is time that a coach decides that the culture of the team is that you have 8 or 9 players and you're going to decide game by game who the starting 5 is. Because the notion that you're my starting 5, I'm going to put Foster and I'm going to put the Proctor out there as the other guard every game, regardless of who you're playing against. I don't really understand it. Yes, you make it the adjustment based on substitution. So what would I do? I think you're absolutely right on Mal. And I think we go all in on defense. So I think Mal and Malik Brown start. And Cooper Flag. So we're 6'9", 6'9", and 7-footer to, in case those two guys can't stop, all in. And then the backcourt, you've been after this since we started. Sion James gets the other spot, and is it K2 or is it the guy that you pointed out has been the most reliable offensive scoring weapon who does start, but maybe it's time that K2 comes off the bench. There's no.
Well, when you present the options the way you did, I think Proctor has to start because I think he's been the most consistent offensive player. I don't know if you were saying that I was saying that about K2 or Proctor.
No, that you said that Proctor. No, absolutely. You've been saying based on stats, based on the fact that in the last game he had 2 good halves. Sometimes he fades in the second half. But no, it would be Proctor with Sion because he's big and tough. So if you go up against a real tough team that's going to want to press you, and I think it's time that coaches move away from this notion of we have to have the starting 5. And I'll go a step further in that, which is because Duke, even at home, this year has this tendency to, like in that first segment, wind up in a hole. Let's do something different. Let's shake up the starting 5 and put in a group that we think is tough enough to fight every step of the way with Auburn. So that's my starting 5. It's Sion, it's
Proctor.
I keep wanting to go McCain. I can't help it. But Proctor, and then I would start Malik Brown, and I would start Coop and Mal, and I would shake up the starting 5. I think K2 is dying to come off the bench with an offensive flow, and if he can't do it, give those minutes to Isaiah Evans. Absolutely. Now, I that's my way of looking at it. It can't be that this is the way we do it. These are our 5 guys. We start with 5. That just doesn't make sense to me.
It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. The only thing, so obviously, as you said, I guess a couple of takeaways from you dropping this new starting 5 on me here. So first off,
go ahead, take it apart.
No, I'm not gonna take it apart. I don't think it's bad. I think it's very interesting. It could be good. I'll give you my pros and cons. Pros, I think Malik Brown. I think Proctor has been our most consistent player. I think Malik Brown and Sion James are certainly within our 5 most consistent players, and I don't think you're stretching at all to say they deserve to start based off of how they've played, which Coach Shire said in several different interviews in several different, places throughout the summer that this team, everyone has to earn their minutes. No one gets their minutes guaranteed. And we've seen that in the past few games with, for example, Caleb Foster's minutes coming down. We haven't seen that with Con Knippel as much. And it is, I know he had 8 assists in the Kansas game, but his shooting has not been up to the level that we would have hoped, especially based off of his first couple of games in the exhibitions. The con, I would say. So pro, as you mentioned, defensive size and intensity is going to be good from the start. The con would be that offensively, you worry about playmaking and shooting when you take out Con Knippel. I know he hasn't shot the ball great, but when you're replacing him with Malik Brown, who's certainly iffy from the 3-point line, but he has been shooting them, which I keep shooting them, Malik, and Sion James, who's been shooting pretty well, but I don't think he's the same caliber of shooter as a Con Knippel, or even a Caleb Foster, who's certainly been cold to start this year. That is the one caveat, is that defensively it's certainly better, but offensively may not be as much. And you're going to have to stagger when you take out Brown or Malawach because you're going to want one of them on the court at all times. But as an idea, I like it. I think it makes sense. I think it rewards guys who've played well. And to go up against this Auburn team, which is, I think, going to have a high level intensity from the start, it makes sense to bring in two solid, reliable guys from the beginning as opposed to having to bring them in 4 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever it ends up being, into the game, and you could be down, 6 to 10 points already. So it makes a lot of sense. I have just two more points I wanted to throw out there, and then we should probably look to wrap this up. So number one, Duke, as you said, Janai Broome plays about 30, 31 minutes per game. Duke has got to take advantage of the minutes when Janai Broome is not on the court. That is going to be a key to the game. It's something I'm going to be watching. Auburn's offense is not as good, not nearly as good, without their hub in the middle, Janai Broome. And then this one I just thought was interesting. So both teams shoot 36% from three in their 7 games this season. So I dug a little bit deeper in their 3 games against ranked opponents. I know Arizona's not ranked anymore, so when Duke played Arizona, they were ranked. Let's just leave it at that. Auburn shot 34% from 3. Duke shot 32%. So it's Auburn definitely slightly better. And when you the stat I gave earlier, in Auburn's 2 wins over the teams that are similar to Duke, they won by 7 points. Duke lost by 8 points in the Kentucky and Kansas games combined. And so that 2-point differential in 3-point percentage could be the difference in these games where the margins are very tight. And Duke has just got to start shooting the ball better. And thankfully, this will be the first of the 4 games where Duke is playing at home. So I'm hoping that guys like Knipple and Foster and even a Mason Gillis can hit shots because they'll be at home in a little bit more comfortable environment.
All right, my last point is, despite my concerns of the press, despite my concern, because what we know is that what we see, Shire sees also, and a lot of other commentators see it also. So I'm going to stay with my starting 5. It's not likely, but even if it's not likely, we'll get there within the first 4 minutes. There'll be substitutions. There'll be other things. So my prediction actually for this game is that it's going to be played in the 60s. And it may not even get, maybe low 70. Maybe. I'm not even certain. In which case, it's an epic defensive battle that Duke is going to win by 5 points. They're going to win 69-64, and their defense is strong, which I'm not worried. I'm not worried about the defensive ability, even against, Janai Broome, who is a clearly candidate for best player in the country. There is enough defensive caliber players there to slow it down. And then what it does for Caleb Foster, what it does for Mason Gillis, and especially K2, is they get to watch the flow of the game first. And players don't like to come off the bench, but when you're watching the flow of the game, you have this opportunity to say, I see what, the coaches are yelling. They're saying, look, here's what we need to do differently. And you're going in there with a mission, as opposed to, yes, this is starting plan for the starting 5, but often we find ourselves in a hole. So shake it up. Duke wins by 5. That's what I got.
I also think Duke wins. I don't have a score prediction, though, so I'll just leave it at that. I think Duke gets back on track with a big win at home over Auburn. If you're new to the channel, like this video, subscribe, leave a comment. We want to hear from you. Share it with a friend. It helps us grow. And with that, we'll see you guys after the Auburn game sometime around 11:15, 11:30 Eastern here on the East Coast. And, yeah, see you guys next time. Peace.
That's it. Peace out.